In the scorching heat of August, 480 years before Christ was born, a narrow mountain pass in Greece became the stage for one of history's most legendary confrontations. Here, where sulfur springs bubbled from the earth and gave the place its ominous name, the Hot Gates, a small band of warriors would face the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled. This was not just a battle between armies. It was a collision between two entirely different worlds, two philosophies of life and death, freedom and submission. On one side stood the might of the Persian Empire, stretching from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of India, ruled by a king who claimed to be the representative of God on earth. On the other stood a handful of Greek warriors, led by men who believed that freedom was worth more than life itself. The Persians came with numbers that seemed to blot out the horizon. The Greeks came with something else entirely, a conviction so fierce it would echo through 25 centuries of human memory. This is the story of 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas, who chose to die rather than kneel. But it's also the story of how their sacrifice ignited a flame that would burn down the greatest empire on earth. The battle that followed would reshape the ancient world and plant the seeds of everything we call Western civilization today. It would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the size of your army, but the strength of your conviction. The year was 480 BCE, and across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, in the golden halls of Persepolis, Xerxes I sat upon a throne that commanded the largest empire humanity had ever known, from the Nile Delta to the Hindu Kush, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf. His banners flew over lands that held perhaps 50 million souls. He was called the King of Kings, the Great King, the ruler who cast his shadow over 3 continents. Yet for all his power, for all the tribute that flowed like rivers into his treasury, Xerxes nursed a wound that would not heal. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent an expedition across the sea to punish 2 insignificant Greek cities that had dared support a rebellion in Persian territory. That expedition had ended in catastrophe at a place called Marathon, where outnumbered Greek warriors had shattered the Persian army and sent its survivors fleeing back across the sea in shame. For Persia, a power that measured its strength in the submission of nations, this defeat was more than a military setback. It was a crack in the foundation of imperial invincibility, a whisper that even the mightiest empire could bleed. Darius had sworn to return, to burn Athens and Sparta to ash, but death had claimed him before he could make good on that oath. Now that burden fell to his son, and Xerxes would not make his father's mistake. He would not send an expedition. He would come himself, at the head of an army so vast that resistance would seem not just futile, but insane. For 4 years, the machinery of empire had turned toward this single purpose. From every corner of the known world, soldiers had been summoned. Immortals from Persia itself, their ranks always kept at exactly 10,000 strong. Scythian horsemen from the steppes, their bows deadly atop. Galician sailors whose ships ruled the Mediterranean. Indian war elephants that could crush a man in armor like an eggshell. Arab camel riders, Ethiopian spearmen with shields of zebra hide, Thracian peltasts with their crescent shields and javelins. The numbers were staggering. Ancient chroniclers would later claim that Xerxes assembled over 2 million fighting men, though modern scholars believe the true figure was closer to 200,000. Even at that reduced estimate, it represented the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient world, an army that stretched for miles when on the march, consuming the countryside like a plague of locusts. But if Persia was a vast empire united under one man's will, Greece was its perfect opposite, a fractured landscape of over 1,000 independent city-states, each jealously guarding its own laws, its own gods, its own vision of how free men should live. Athens and Sparta, the 2 most powerful, were as different as fire and ice. Athens buzzed with merchants and philosophers, its citizens gathering in the agora to debate and argue, its navy patrolling sea lanes thick with trade. It was democracy in its infancy, chaotic and brilliant and alive with possibility. Sparta was something else entirely, a warrior state forged in the crucible of constant warfare, where boys were taken from their mothers at 7 and molded into living weapons. Here, there were no merchants or philosophers, only soldiers and the women who bore them. Here, death in battle was not feared but welcomed, and to return home carrying your shield meant victory, while to be carried upon it meant honor. The Spartans had a saying that summed up their entire philosophy of backlife: come with your shield or on it. These two cities had been enemies more often than allies, their rivalry stretching back generations. But now, as Persian scouts probed the northern borders and refugees brought tales of an approaching horde, something unprecedented happened. Fear of Persian domination forced Greece's quarreling city-states into an alliance that should have been impossible. In the spring of 481 BCE, representatives from dozens of cities gathered at the narrow isthmus of Corinth. There, in a moment that defied centuries of Greek, they see tradition or an oath that transcended their ancient rivalries. They would stand together against the Persian tide. Sparta would lead the land forces, Athens would command the fleet, and together they would show the world that free men could not be conquered by slaves, no matter how many millions Xerxes brought across the sea. The strategy was born from necessity and shaped by Greece's mountainous terrain. The Persians could not simply march south and overwhelm the Greek cities. Geography itself would be their ally. Greece was a land of narrow passes and steep valleys, of coastal straits where ships could be bottlenecked and destroyed. If they chose their ground carefully, the Greeks could turn their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. The first line of defense would be at Thermopylae, the hot gates, where the mountains came down almost to the sea and left only a narrow corridor through which any army would have to pass. Here, the Persian advantage in numbers would mean nothing. Here, a few thousand determined men could hold back an empire. The question was not whether such men existed. Be found. The question was whether they could, in time. Meanwhile, in the north, the Persian juggernaut continued its inexorable advance. Xerxes had not simply assembled an army. He had moved the entire apparatus of empire across the Hellespont on two massive pontoon bridges, each of ancient marvel engineering that took months to complete. Hundreds of ships lashed together, covered with planks and earth so solid that horses could gallop across without fear. When storms destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes had flown into such a rage that he ordered the sea itself punished with 300 lashes. Whether this tale was truth or propaganda, it captured something essential about the man who now led the greatest invasion in ancient history. This was not a king who accepted limits, whether imposed by nature or by men. The army that crossed into Europe was unlike anything the world had seen. It moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path, leaving behind a trail of trampled earth and empty storehouses. Villages that submitted were spared, but stripped of supplies. Those that resisted were erased from the map, their populations sold into slavery, their buildings reduced to ash and rubble. As summer deepened and the Persian host rolled south through Thrace and Macedonia, word of their approach spread faster than their actual advance. Refugees clogged the roads with tales of an army that drank rivers dry and blotted out the sun with their arrows. Some cities, seeing the futility of resistance, sent Greek earth and water to Xerxes as tokens of submission. Others simply evacuated, their populations fleeing south ahead of the storm. But at Thermopylae, a different kind of preparation was underway. King Leonidas of Sparta had made his choice, and it was a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of Western civilization itself. The festival of Carnia was sacred to the Spartans, a time when their armies were forbidden to march to war. The Olympic Games were also underway, and their ancient truce made military action doubly blasphemous. Yet Leonidas knew that waiting for religious obligations to end would mean watching Xerxes march unopposed into the heart of Greece. The king faced an impossible choice between sacred law and national survival. His solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. He would not take the full Spartan army, for that would violate every tradition his people held dear. Instead, he would lead a personal expedition, a royal bodyguard of 300 men chosen not for their youth but for their experience. These were the Hippii, the elite warriors who had already proven themselves in countless battles. More importantly, each had been selected because he had living sons to carry on his bloodline. They were men who could die without leaving Sparta weakened. The 300 were not young heroes seeking glory. They were fathers and husbands, veterans whose beards were streaked with gray, whose bodies bore the scars of a dozen campaigns. They understood what this mission meant, what it demanded. When their wives and mothers came to see them off, The women of Sparta spoke words that would echo through eternity. "Come back with your shield," they said, "or on it." But the 300 would not stand alone. As Leonidas marched north through the rocky passes of the Peloponnese, his small force was joined by contingents from across Greece. 700 Thespians volunteered to fight beside the Spartans, knowing full well they marched to certain death. 400 Thebans were compelled to join, their loyalty uncertain but their presence required. Soldiers from Photis, from Locris, from a dozen smaller cities swelled the ranks. By the time they reached Thermopylae, Leonidas commanded roughly 7,000 men. Against any normal army, it would have been suicide. Against the Persian horde, it was something beyond suicide. It was a deliberate act of defiance that said some things were worth dying for, that freedom had a price that free men were willing to pay. The pass itself was perfectly suited for their desperate gamble. At its narrowest point, the corridor between mountain and sea was barely 50 feet wide. Here, the Phocians had built a defensive wall in earlier times, and Leonidas ordered it rebuilt and strengthened. Behind this barrier, his men would make their stand. The position was as much psychological as it was tactical. Any army wanting to march south would have to come through this bottleneck, and here the Persians would discover that numbers alone could not guarantee victory. The pass would force them to attack in narrow columns, negating their advantage in cavalry and archery. More importantly, it would force them to fight the kind of battle that Greeks had been perfecting for generations. The phalanx was more than a military formation. It was the physical embodiment of Greek ideals about citizenship and courage. Each hoplite carried a bronze shield that covered not just himself, but half the man to his left. To break and run meant exposing your neighbor to death. To stand firm meant trusting the man on your right to protect you in turn. It was democracy made flesh, a system where survival depended on every citizen doing his duty. The Spartan phalanx was the most fearsome version of this formation. Their shields were polished to mirror brightness. Their bronze breastplates gleamed like gold, and their long spears formed a forest of iron points that could stop any charge. But it was not their equipment that made them deadly. It was their training, their discipline, their absolute refusal to yield ground no matter what came against them. As the Greek forces settled into their positions, scouts brought word that the Persian advance guard had been spotted. The horizon to the north was dark with dust clouds, and refugees spoke of an army that stretched beyond the edges of sight. Xerxes was coming, and with him came the fate of the world. On the third day after their arrival at Thermopylae, the Greeks saw them. First came the cavalry scouts, their horses picking their way carefully down the mountain paths. Then came the standards and banners, a rainbow of colors representing every corner of the Persian Empire. Finally came the army itself, a river of humanity that flowed down from the hills like a force of nature. They made camp across the plain north of the pass, and their tents stretched to every horizon. Cooking fires sparkled like stars in the gathering dusk, and the sound of their voices was like the murmur of the sea. For 3 days, they continued to arrive, until the very earth seemed to groan under their weight. Xerxes established his royal pavilion on a hill overlooking the pass, a palace of silk and gold from which he could watch the coming slaughter. He sent heralds to the Greek camp with an ultimatum that had brought nations to their knees. "Surrender your weapons," the message read, "and you will be spared. Continue this madness, and you will all die." Leonidas sent back a reply that became legend. "Molon Labe," he said. "Come and take them." On the 4th day, the killing began. Xerxes sent forward the Medes and Scythians, warriors from the heartland of his empire, expecting them to sweep aside this token resistance in a matter of hours. They advanced in dense columns, their war cries echoing between the cliffs, their weapons glittering in the morning sunday. The Greeks waited in silence. When the Persians came within spear range, the phalanx struck like a bronze-tipped thunderbolt. The front rank leveled their spears and charged, their shields locked together, their voices raised in the ancient war cry that had terrified enemies for centuries. The collision was like the crash of waves against stone. The Persian front ranks crumpled under the impact. Men fell screaming, pierced by spear points that punched through leather and bronze. Those behind pressed forward, driven by their own momentum and the pressure of thousands more behind them. But the pass was too narrow, the Greek line too solid. Bodies piled up in windows, the living stumbling over the dead, the narrow corridor becoming a charnel house. For hours the battle raged without pause. The Persians hurled themselves forward in wave after wave, only to break against the Greek shields like surf against a seawall. When their spears shattered, the Greeks drew their swords. When their swords broke, they fought with daggers and bare hands. The ground grew slick with blood, and still they held. By midday, the Persian assault had faltered. Their commanders called for a retreat, leaving behind carpets of dead that stretched back toward their camp. Xerxes watched from his golden throne, his face growing darker with each failed attack. This was not how empires conquered their enemies. This was not sun began its descent toward the western mountains, how the King of Kings claimed his victories. As the Xerxes made his decision, he would send forward his immortals, the 10,000 elite guards who had never known defeat. Surely these professionals could accomplish what the provincial levies had failed to do. But the immortals found the pass no more yielding than had their predecessors. Their wicker shields splintered against Greek bronze. Their short spears snapped against the longer doru of the phalanx. The narrow ground that should have been their highway to victory became their tomb. By evening, they too were streaming back toward their lines, leaving behind hundreds of their supposedly immortal dead. The first day belonged to Greece. The second dawn broke with a crimson sky, as if the heavens themselves were stained with the blood of the previous day's slaughter. Across the Persian camp, the mood had shifted from confident anticipation to grim determination. The bodies of the immortals lay stacked like cordwood, waiting for the funeral pyres that would consume them. These were men who had conquered Babylon, who had brought Egypt to its knees, who had never tasted defeat. Yet here, in this god-forsaken mountain pass, they had been broken by a handful of Greeks who refused to die. Xerxes rose before the sun, his sleep haunted by the sight of his elite warriors fleeing in disorder. The great king who had commanded the submission of nations now faced a humiliation that threatened very foundation of his power. Word of the previous day's failure would spread through the camp like wildfire, and with it would come doubt. If the immortals could not break through, what force on earth could? The answer came from his advisors, men who had studied warfare in a dozen kingdoms. The Greeks, they argued, were fighting with desperate courage, but courage could not sustain men forever. They would tire, their ranks would thin, their weapons would dull. All that was needed was persistence, wave after wave of attacks that would grind them down like grain beneath a millstone. The Persian Empire and an inexhaustible supply of men. Eventually, mathematics would triumph over heroism. But mathematics required time, and time was a luxury Xerxes could not afford. Every day spent at Thermopylae was a day that allowed the Greek fleet to strengthen its positions at Artemisium. Every hour of delay gave Athens more time to evacuate its population, Sparta more time to mobilize its full army. The invasion that was meant to crush Greek resistance in a single devastating blow was becoming a siege, and sieges were dangerous things for empires that depended on the myth of invincibility. As the sun climbed higher, the Persian host stirred to life once more. This time, Xerxes had assembled a different kind of force. Instead of relying on the disciplined formations of his elite units, he would unleash the wild fury of the empire's most savage tribes, Scythian horsemen who drank the blood of their enemies, Thracian peltasts who had learned warfare in the brutal mountains of the north, Ethiopian warriors who had never known defeat in their desert homeland. These were men who fought not for pay or imperial glory, but for the pure joy of killing. They had no complex tactics, no elaborate formations. They would simply charge forward and overwhelm the Greeks through sheer ferocity and numbers. Surely no defensive line could withstand the primitive fury of 10,000 screaming barbarians. The Greeks watched this new assault develop with the calm efficiency of veteran soldiers. They had seen the bodies from the previous day, had counted the Persian dead, and found their own losses to be almost negligible. The pass was holding, the strategy was working, and confidence flowed through their ranks like wine. When the Persian war horns sounded and the tribal warriors began their charge, the phalanx was ready. But this attack was different from the disciplined advances of the day before. The barbarian tribes came forward in a howling mass, their painted faces twisted with rage, their weapons raised high above their heads. They had no formation to maintain, no order to preserve. They were a human avalanche of steel and fury, and they struck the Greek line with the force of a thunderclap. For a moment, the phalanx wavered. The sheer violence of the assault, the demonic screams of warriors who seemed more beast than man, tested the nerves of even the most seasoned veterans. Shields battled the impact offled under axes, spear points found gaps in armor, and Greek blood began to flow for the first time since the battle began. But if the barbarians fought with savage fury, the Greeks fought with something more powerful. Discipline forged in the crucible of a lifetime's training. Even as their comrades fell around them, the survivors closed ranks and hell bent their ground. The phalanx but did not break, absorbing the Persian charge like a sponge absorbing water. And then, with mechanical precision, it began to push back. The slaughter that followed was even more terrible than the previous day's carnage. The barbarian warriors, magnificent in their individual courage, had no answer for the coordinated thrust of the phalanx. They died in heaps before the Greek shields, their wild charges breaking like waves against an immovable cliff. By reach the time the Sund at zenith, the pass was choked with bodies, and the survivors were streaming back toward their lines in panic. Xerxes watched this second failure, his golden from throne, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with rage. 2 days, 2 defeats, and still there the Greeks held impossible position. His advisors fell silent, unwilling to meet the gaze of a king whose fury could mean death. Who dis for anyone the great pleased him. King who had bridged the Hellespont and commanded the loyalty of 50 million subjects was being humiliated by 300 Spartans and a handful of their allies. But if the second day had been a disaster for Persian arms, it had also a crucial reveal weakness in the Greek position. During the fiercest fighting, scouts had noticed Greek warriors being rotated out of the front line when they grew tired. The defenders were managing their strength carefully, ensuring that fresh troops always faced the Persian assault. This was intelligent tactics, but it also meant that the Greek force was smaller than it appeared. They could not afford heavy casualties, could not sustain a prolonged battle of attrition. More importantly, prisoners taken during the fighting had revealed disturbing intelligence about Greek intentions. This was not a desperate last stand by men trapped in an impossible position. This was a deliberate sacrifice, a calculated gamble to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. Leonidas and his men had come here to die, and their very willingness to embrace death made them more dangerous than any army that fought for victory. As night fell over the bloody pass, Persian campfires stretched across the plain like fallen stars. The army that had seemed invincible just days before was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between conquering subjects and fighting free men. Subjects fought because they had to. Free men fought because they chose to. And men who chose to die for their ideals were the most dangerous enemies any tyrant could face. In the Greek camp, the mood was cautiously optimistic despite the day's losses. They had proven that the Persian army could be stopped, that the supposedly invincible force that had terrorized half the world was made up of mortal men who bled and died like any others. But they also knew that time was running out. Xerxes had reserves that seemed endless, while every Greek casualty was irreplaceable. They could win a dozen battles like this and still face inevitable defeat. The hot gates fell silent at last, but their echoes would thunder across eternity. Leonidas and his 300 had bought Greece the time it desperately needed, and that time would prove more precious than all the gold in Xerxes' treasury. At Salamis, the Greek fleet would shatter Persian naval power. At Plataea, their armies would break the empire's land forces forever. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had lit a fire that would burn the greatest empire on earth to ash. Sometimes, the most powerful victories come not from those who live to celebrate them, but from those who die to make them possible.